Good morning, and let's move. Lots to cover here weather-wise, but I'll start with the review of last week, and again, we have just seen a number of repeated changes from much above to much below, and many extremes in between. But if you take the averages of all that, of course, you get something somewhere in the middle, which is not reflective of what we've experienced. But given the cool start that we had up until the last few days with the heat wave, our temperatures for the average of the last week, most of the state, especially the northern part of the state, remained cooler than normal. And you can see that here on the left, some cases 3-4 degrees Fahrenheit below normal, less as you go to the south. And that's been a pattern we've seen a lot of this growing season. Relatively cooler temperatures in the northern part of the state versus the south. Precipitation wise, note that this total does not include precip overnight. We had some significant, especially up in the Upper Peninsula, some heavy rains in certain parts of the state last night, but this goes through yesterday morning, and you can see that in that particular image that the largest totals were across the south, and that reflects some of the in some cases heavy thunderstorms, severe weather. We had some certainly high wind damage in the southwestern part of the Lower Peninsula here earlier in the week, and even some large hail reported. But that was generally confined to the southern part of the state. But you can see down here in the southern part of the state, that was where we saw the largest totals, at least through yesterday. Some cases 2, as much as 3 inches of rain fell, much less as you went north from that, especially up into upper Michigan. But again, that has changed in the last 24 hours given the weather last night. I'll talk about that in just a second. Degree day totals here for the season. These are base 50 corn degree days. So the 8650 totals, that's what's on the back of your seed corn, the numbers here. And if we look at this assumes a start date of the beginning of May up through the 14th. And given the very, very warm temperatures of the last few days, you can see now we've had a surplus in some parts of the state. And given then the cool weather last week, we fell back behind normal. You can see there still are deficits. So a little bit behind normal in accumulation in the far northern part of the state, but we're ahead across the south. That's especially true, again, given the last few days here with temperatures well in the 90s in some cases. We've been, and if you do the mathematics here over the last couple of days with a high in the mid 90s and a low in the mid 70s, you're picking up 30 units a day. That's for Michigan. That's top end. We don't see much larger or higher than that. So that's just about as much as we ever see. So again, deficits north, a little bit of a surplus at this point in the season in the south. Well, the big news here, I think the lead story is our heat wave, which has impacted almost all, the vast majority of the state, certainly southern portions of the state for the last couple of days, is shifting south and eastward and out of Michigan. And on this particular graphic here on the left-hand side, I have temperatures here over the last couple of hours. This is the spatial pattern. And just as importantly, one of the key, characteristics of this heat wave was the very, very high humidities. And here we've got dew point temperatures, which is a graphic or a variable we don't look at as often, but it's important. It basically is a direct measurement of how much water vapor is in the air. And again, as we get up, anytime we see the dew point temperature in Michigan here really get up in the upper 60s towards 70s, it starts to feel really, really muggy. The dew point is always at or less than the air temperature. And it's, again, the temperature at which we begin to see condensation form if the air were cooled to that temperature. And again, so the larger it is, the more water vapors that's there. But you can see spatially here a pretty strong gradient, and it starts with temperature here, about a 10-degree increase in temperature, which once you go to the southeastern corner of the state versus the northwest. And also, just as importantly, we see a drop off of about 5 to 10 degrees in the dew point temperature with less humidity. And basically what you've got here is a cool front currently moving through the state, and that's the leading edge of that. And it's pushing to the south and east. And as a result of that, it still will be pretty warm today with full sun and windy. That's another thing for today. But the oppressive heat conditions we've had with heat indices in some cases over 100 degrees, that's all shifted south. And on the bottom here, this is the all hazards map here from the National Weather Service. You can see all of the heat advisories and excessive heat warnings, et cetera, that we had in the state yesterday. All of those have been shifted now to areas to our south, the Ohio Valley and the south. So yes, it will be warm again today because the cold front that's going through, it is a cool front, but it's not quite, well, it's not like what we would see in the cool season, but stand by because there is cooler air coming. It's on the way, but it's going to take a little while to get here. One thing, anytime we see extremes like we've seen over the last day or two in Michigan, you can probably relate to this. Typically, we see the threat of severe weather, and obviously we saw that in the upper Midwest last night. This is a storm report summarizing high wind, tornadoes, hail occurrences here over the last 24 hours. And you can see that, Wisconsin took the brunt of this particular event, but we did get some rough weather in portions of upper Michigan, and then also some reports of high winds across mainly the northern half of the lower peninsula into areas of the thumb. There was some outflow ahead of these thunderstorms. But one of the key factors with this particular system as it's going through right now, and I'll show that next here, where the precip is now, is the frontal passage is coming in the early morning hours when conditions in the atmosphere are most stable. That's when we tend to see the least vertical lift. And again, Wisconsin was at the wrong place at the wrong time because it occurred during the peak heating. And that's where we saw all that rough weather, including, unfortunately, a couple of tornadoes. So this morning here on the weather map, we've got this frontal boundary. You can see the blue line here currently make its way into southeastern lower Michigan. There is a line of scattered showers and thunderstorms here. Note it's not filled in, and the rainfall has been pretty spotty. We've had here locally in the East Lansing area a thunder shower for about the last hour to hour and a half, and there's been some rumbles of thunder, but the rainfall has been actually somewhat surprisingly light, only a few hundredths of an inch. It depends on where you are, but again, I think the important word here is scattered. Some areas will pick up some significant rain. This is all pushing off to the south and east and will exit the southeastern corner here of the state in a few hours later this morning. That ushers in, as I mentioned, cooler, certainly relatively cooler. It doesn't take much to be cooler than where we were yesterday in terms of the air mass, but also noticeably less humid. Another thing to note here, a lot of these black lines, these isobars on the map, big pressure differences here in the atmosphere. We are going to see very windy conditions here today and also during the day, especially tomorrow. So look for winds to shift around to the west and probably be up 20, 25 miles per hour with some higher gusts. The same will be true tomorrow. Most of the state, though, other than the southeast where these showers and thunder showers are still going to be with us, turning mostly sunny, windy, and again, warm, but less so than yesterday. By tomorrow, you can see not much green on our map here, just and another cool front approaching here from the north and west. And that is the leading edge of to most areas in the 70s to near 80 in the south tomorrow, and probably be stuck in the 70s, even some upper 60s in the far north on Saturday. Low temperatures falling back mostly into the 50s, low and mid 50s, but we'll get some 40s up north. So a little bit like what we saw last week with that cool spell that we had of several days. And that lasts a good 2 to 3 days. After this, after today in the southeast, the next chance for precipitation in most of the state coming overnight Saturday into Sunday. That will be some scattered showers possible, but I think it'll be confined to the far northwestern portions of the state. And then that'll spread to the south and east on Sunday. But it is not looking at this point in time like a widespread event. So again, the operative phrase here, word, is scattered. While there is a threat of showers, and I think most areas in the state, it'll be late Sunday into Monday and possibly Tuesday. The other big news, and I think larger news, is that after this relative especially compared to what we've been dealing with over the last week with virtually a chance almost every day, we've got several dry days here, at least 2 to 3, probably more than that, into next week. But the other big news is it's going to be warming up again by early next week, and that's where I'm going to go here next. So if looking at this map here, I mentioned a nice, cool, dry sunny period here. And the other part of this too is if you got outdoor activities this weekend, boy, I don't think you can do much better, especially on Saturday. Again, hot temperatures in the low and mid 70s during the day, full sun, and then cool at night. Just almost ideal conditions for being outdoors. And if you look at the weather map here, this is for Saturday morning. And you look at the upper air. Notice here that this big troughing feature over eastern North America that has northwesterly flow over Michigan and the Great Lakes region here on the right-hand side here. These are surface temperature anomalies, so relative to normal. You can see lots of blues, even some purples here. So cooler than normal, but note here off to our west, here's another one of these big ridges. And you note the other thing is that for the middle of June, this kind of upper air pattern with these large troughs, another big trough out over the west coast, they're really cool with this under the middle of that. And then of course under the ridge you've got heat and dryness, and then another ridge. These are very, very large, almost extreme features for this time of the year, and we've seen a lot of that this the spring and into the early summer, and it's, at least for the foreseeable future, it's going to continue. The other important thing to note is that they're moving from west to east across. So we don't stay in any one pattern like the upcoming cool down for very long, for more than a few days. And then we move to another extreme. And that's what we're looking at here for much of the next week. So while the weekend is very, very cool, or I'll almost call it unseasonably cool, but very pleasant, by the beginning of next week, look, that ridge that was out over the Great Plains now moves over to the Great Lakes region. This is Tuesday morning. And along with that, we go right back up to much above normal. So in terms of our temperatures, look for a return of certainly the 80s and probably the 90s again by the first half, at least, of next week. So I think that's the big pattern change, cool weekend, but then back up into the heat next week. Precipitation totals here for the upcoming week. I mentioned, again, other than the southeast, probably not looking at any precip until the end of the weekend or early next week, but generally a drier than normal week across much of the state. Less than 1/4 inch for much of lower Michigan, and then maybe a half to as much as 3/4 inch across the north. That's where we'll see the highest coverage, aerial coverage, and greatest totals, mostly across the upper peninsula. But in most areas, it will be a drier than normal week. Here's another important piece of this. We're nearing the summer solstice coming up next week, and of course, astronomically, that's the most direct rays or most direct sunshine we get the whole year. And with that, and with even with cooler temperatures but relatively dry air, we're going to have very relatively high potential evapotranspiration rates. So the atmospheric demand for water is going to be abnormally high over the next week. These are the totals here through Wednesday evening, and you can see some up here almost up to near 2 inches. That's really, really large for Michigan in any month. July and August are usually our biggest months for potential. This is the reference value. This is what the forecast meteorological conditions would suggest for water demand, and it's high. So something to keep an eye on. It's a little earlier than we typically think about this with irrigation and adding water to our crops, but I put it in here because it is unusual. We'll be seeing these reference values of a 1/4 inch or more per day. That again, for Michigan, that's very, very high, and with a whole week up above 1.7 up to 2, that is a very, very water intensive week. So keep an eye on that. You may need water, especially shallower rooting systems. They don't have as much to take out, or whether not as much of a rooting zone to take water out of, but it will change quickly because of the atmospheric demand. And again, they will need water. Finally here, looking at the medium range forecast guidance, how long does this pattern shift or change come? A lot of confidence in the medium range guidance, both the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks. You can see this ridging feature here over in the lower left. That's the jet stream, and that is forecast generally. Again, there's some movement there, but in general, the ridge is forecast to persist over the middle of the country, and that's a strong likelihood of warmer than normal mean temperatures. You can see that in the upper right here with our mean temperatures forecast over almost all of the central U.S., including Michigan, here forecast to be warmer than normal. And also down in the lower right hand, normal to below normal precipitation totals. So that's going to depend. I think it's a little iffy. You can definitely see to our south that it is the guidance is suggesting drier than normal. We're sort of in between. And just like we saw last night, there will be times when we see thunderstorms develop upstream in places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then move over the top of the ridge into Michigan, and expect at least one round of that probably some point early next week, and then maybe beyond that. But it's a very, very summer-like pattern, but the big issue is that ridge and the strength of it, and then the warm air that's associated with it. So wrapping up here, again, we'll see an end to the heat wave is on its way southward. That's fine, I'm sure, for most people. Some scattered showers for the next couple of hours, but in most parts of the state, mostly sunny, a little cooler, less humid, or noticeably than certainly yet versus yesterday, and windy. And then tomorrow and Saturday and into Sunday, in most areas, we're going to be looking at a just gorgeous type of weather forecast here with cool, dry, and windy conditions expected for that time frame. But then at the beginning of next week, a significant warm up, maybe some scattered showers, especially across northern parts of the state early next week. But we'll look for heat to return by early next week. And as you just saw in the medium range, possibly more of that here for the remainder of June. At this point in time, if you're wondering, well, what about beyond that? The medium range, it's not clear, but most of the medium range guidance suggests that we'll see something less warm, maybe by early July. So we'll cover that here next week. Well, with that, I'll wrap up and introduce our speaker next week for a virtual breakfast next Thursday. And we got a 2-for-1 from the Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. We have happy to have Dr. Young-Suk Dong, who's going to be, of course, most of you know him as our irrigation specialist, and he will be speaking next Thursday. So don't miss that. Weather will follow that up. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Phil to talk about credits. So Phil, take away.